Good afternoon and welcome to this broadcast from Cardiff Metropolitan University. Prynhawn da a chroeso i'r darllediad hwn gan Brifysgol Metropolitan Caerdydd. It's midday and time for the 5th episode of our summer professional webinar series produced by the Cardiff Partnership for Initial Teacher Education, a presentation which was originally broadcast in April this year. Your presenters today are Emma Thayer and Tom Breeze from Cardiff Metropolitan University. Today's webinar is introduced by the Director of Teacher Education and Professional Learning, Dr Anna Bryant.
Diolch yn fawr, Tom. Croeso mawr i chi gyd I Bartneriaeth Caerdydd, a pleser mawr heno I ni gyflwyno'r 5th webinar yn y gyfres eleni. A byddai'n cymryd fformat bach yn wahanol heno gyda fideo asynchronous, a byddai'n ffocysu ar addysgau drawscurriculaidd sy'n wrth gwrs yn berthnasol iawn i'r cwricwlwm newydd. A warm welcome to you all to the 5th in the series of the Cardiff IT Partnership Research webinars, which will take a slightly different format tonight through an asynchronous video. This session will focus on cross-curricular pedagogies, which of course is very pertinent to the work around the curriculum for Wales currently. We do hope that these webinars are really beginning to support a discussion on how research and professional practice talk to each other as part of our research-informed clinical practice model. When we are also looking at different format for these webinars to stimulate further interaction and engagement from you. So today is going to be an asynchronous session, and then during the next sessions in 2 weeks' time, and it's quite a short gap because of the Easter holidays, on Thursday, May the 6th, we'll have a panel discussion on how the research champions are helping student research to have impact in partnership schools. And then on Thursday, June the 10th, we'll be looking at the principles of professional inquiry, and I think we might try something different through perhaps a normal Teams meeting with breakout groups here. Any feedback on the webinar, please pop it in the chat, if that's in terms of content, or the themes, or perhaps what format and process you found useful with these webinars. And as always, please submit your questions tonight and make a note of your role whilst you do that as well. So, and just as a reminder, these webinars are recorded and are available on Teams for a month after the webinar on the link. And we'll also host these on our Cardiff Partnership team site in the direct channel as well. So it's a great pleasure tonight to welcome Tom Breeze, the subject leader for our PGC music programme, and Emma Thayer, who's the subject leader of the PGC drama programme. And both also head up our clinical practice work stream. So please ask questions tonight, because Tom and Emma will discuss how we can approach working between subject disciplines in the context of the new curriculum for Wales. Donaldson has called for powerful connections to be made. So how essentially then can we ensure that the connections we make are powerful and not artificial? So without further ado, I'd like to hand over now to Tom and Emma. Diolch yn fawr.
Welcome everyone. What you're about to see is an edited version of a lead lecture that we put together for our student teachers here at Cardiff Met on our PGC programmes, which gives an insight into our own research into the expressive arts area of learning and experience, and the findings of a systematic literature review that we did, but to broaden our gaze a little bit more, to give an insight into cross-curricular pedagogies more generally, drawing upon some additional research about how to make meaningful connections between subjects within and across AOLEs.
We really felt that at the moment, schools are crying out for this sort of input as everybody tries to get to grips with how we interpret the new curriculum. So we thought it was important, even though we originally filmed it for our student teachers, to put it out there more widely as a service to our school colleagues. It was filmed in a socially distanced way in our office, as you'll see when you see it now. It's pre-recorded, but we have got people staffing the Q&A function. So please do feel free to ask your questions and make your comments because we do want these webinars to be interactive and we will interact with you through that medium. We hope you enjoy the lecture.
Hi everyone, welcome to this lead lecture on theories of cross-curricular pedagogies. I'm Emma Thayer and I'm going to be delivering today with Tom Breeze. So our aims for this session are to obviously introduce you to key theories of cross-curricular pedagogy that speak across phases. This is a cross-phase session, so hopefully this will speak directly to both primary and secondary. We'll give you some concrete examples of how cross-curricular pedagogy can work when implemented in practice, and we'll give you some ideas that hopefully will give you some ways forward.
Now let's zoom out all the way for a minute and look at why this idea of making connections between subject disciplines is in the Donaldson Successful Futures Report and has found its way into the new curriculum. Now, Donaldson is drawing on the work of the OECD and other organisations internationally who've been looking at international curriculum trends. And what a lot of these organisations are pointing out is the fact that the future is unpredictable, things are moving fast, it's no longer possible for us to kind of assume that we can fill our pupils with a certain set of skills and knowledge and that will make them kind of useful, viable, employable citizens for the whole of their working life. And one of the defining features that they've kind of pointed out here is that we need to give our learners the capacity to make connections between what were originally considered perhaps quite discrete subject areas. They need to be able to transfer their knowledge and understanding across those subject disciplines and into unfamiliar ones that we may not even know about at the point that we're providing their education. The OECD talk about the importance of the mobilisation of the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes. They point out that our future-ready students need to have both the broad knowledge and the specialised knowledge and to be able to kind of connect those dots between them, and that just working within a traditional subject discipline is no longer going to be sufficient. That if you're looking for any of that material, you're looking for the OECD's Education 2030 agenda, in which they try to define knowledge, skills, but also dispositions, values, competencies, in order that we can think in a much more kind of broad and connected way.
So coming back into a national perspective and looking to the kind of seminal Successful Futures report from Professor Graham Donaldson back in 2015, in that document we're all hopefully quite familiar now with the 12 pedagogical principles that he advocates, one of which is Pedagogical Principle 8, which states that good teaching and learning ranges within and across areas of learning and experience. If we look in more detail in the guidance that Donaldson provides in and around Pedagogical Principle 8, we can see some interesting pointers at what we as classroom practitioners need to be considering in order to make sure that pupils are able to connect the dots, as Tom just mentioned. So if we have a look at this quote here, Donaldson talks about artificial connections would render the exercise meaningless, and he's talking about the exercise of bringing subject disciplines together. But if powerful connections within and between areas of learning and experience can be found, they are likely to improve and reinforce learning in the constituent disciplines. So there's some really important kind of pointers there and almost success criteria in a way of how we might be examining the efficacy of cross-curricular pedagogies when used and witnessed in practice. He says pedagogical approaches that allow connections to be made via common questions, concepts or skills should be explored within and across areas of learning and experience. So some really important starting points there from Successful Futures that is going to imbue the rest of this presentation. So we invite you now at this very early stage in the lead lecture to do some thinking in and around what we've analysed from Successful Futures there on the previous slide. So If we were watching this as a YouTube premiere event, we would encourage you to add some of your thoughts to the chat based on the questions that I'm about to pose. So I want us to examine in more depth and detail this notion of maybe a spectrum from artificial connections between subject disciplines to more powerful connections that Donaldson advocates. So I've got some questions for you here. What do you think is meant by artificial connections between subject disciplines and powerful connections? Consider what they might look like between two subjects that you know particularly well. And what could be the dangers of artificial connections between subjects? What outcomes, what negative outcomes could ensue if those connections between subject disciplines are artificial?
Now on the next slide, you can see a quote which those of us who've been investigating this for the last few years have really taken to heart and really used as a kind of guiding light in our thinking. Just while you look at that quote, let's just pause for a moment and remember that if you're watching this lecture now, you are coming at this from either a primary or a secondary perspective, and that means you have a very different kind of angle at looking at this. If you are a primary specialist, you are very comfortable, I would imagine, with the idea of combining subjects into a kind of larger context. That probably doesn't hold as many fears for you as it might do for a secondary subject specialist. Your kind of worries around working in a cross-curricular way might be slightly different to a secondary subject specialist. Now, if you are watching this as a secondary person, it's probably fair to say that your identity flows to a very large extent through your subject. Yes, you're a teacher, but you probably think of yourself as a maths teacher or a science teacher or a music teacher or whatever it might be. And therefore the idea of working in a cross-curricular way will be kind of challenging in a different way for you. And this quote is really important, particularly for us, although it is also very important for primary, that when we start in the process of bringing our subjects together, working in a cross-curricular way, we're looking to synthesize ideas, but that we have to do it in a way that preserves the cherished ideas and ways of thinking that every subject contains. And those of us who are subject specialists, we have our cherished ideas and ways of thinking, and you probably know what those are. You could probably have a stab at expressing those, but it's really important to bear in mind that another subject specialist's sacred things may not be so clear to you. You may not be as aware of them, and that actually part of the interesting kind of side of working in this way is finding out what those are. But it's very, very important that when we do this, we approach this with a deep respect for those important things for our colleagues from other subjects. And that's the case whether we're working at this from a secondary angle or a primary angle.
So we've started quite broad. We've narrowed in a little bit more looking at where cross-curricular pedagogy and curriculum design is coming through in successful futures. We've looked to some seminal literature that Tom has just discussed about who we are as either phase experts or disciplinary experts and what that means to us depending on our phase. We now need to look at some examples coming through in the literature of the different categories that researchers have identified of cross-curricular pedagogy. And what that might do is help us to put a little bit more meat on the bones of what Donaldson means when he talks about artificial connections and powerful connections. So we're going to look first of all to an article that's quoted actually in some very recent research conducted by our very own Dr. Judith Neen. She quotes Drake and Burns 2004, who give us 3 categories that we're going to examine in turn of cross-curricular or integrated curriculum design. And it's worth just mentioning at this juncture that the work that Dr. Judith Neen did was with pioneers who were co-constructing the expressive arts AOLE with practitioners from across phases, including special education settings. So we'll include that in our references list, and it'd be worth having a look at that, because you will get from that article an even deeper sense of what Tom is talking about here, about the different practitioner responses to cross-curricular curriculum design. So back to the categories then. So back to Drake and Burns, who identify 3 categories of integrated curriculum. The first being multidisciplinary. So here we've got the focus being on the individual disciplines, but using themes as a connection between them. And hopefully the graphic there gives you a clue. So pupils could be studying the theme of power and corruption through the lens of each separate subject. So power and corruption in history, power and corruption in geography. There's no implied necessity for the subjects to connect, combine, or become synthesized, but if they're all meeting that same theme, there is an invitation, there's an opportunity maybe of some connections to be made. Which then takes us on to interdisciplinary, which is where we organise the curriculum around learning aspects in common within disciplines, thereby emphasising interdisciplinary skills between the subjects. Now, Donaldson, as we saw earlier on, talks about looking for common concepts, common skills. So this interdisciplinary approach, obviously as a starting point, invites classroom practitioners to look at the individual disciplines and look for the places where there is commonality. And then we've got transdisciplinary. So here teachers build the curriculum around pupils' questions. Now this is more commonly witnessed in the primary context. So for example, exploring a topic through a project, so the disciplines are subsidiary to the topic. The example that Dr. Judith Neen actually used when she explained this on our podcast episode was that the students or the pupils might be studying dinosaurs, and they might have lots of questions straight off the bat about dinosaurs. What do they eat? When were they around? How did they behave? And that leads the curriculum design into subject discipline areas based on and rooted in a kind of inquiry model of teaching and learning. So we need to zoom out again at this point. We've got these 3 categories of integrated curriculum design, and it's clear that the Welsh Government were very influenced by this literature when it was considering and putting together its draft curriculum documents that were published back in 2019 in and around our areas of learning and experience. And what we note over the next 2 slides are how the descriptions of cross-curricular pedagogy and curriculum design change from the first iteration of these curriculum documents to the final documents that we've got. And there are some really important messages that I want to draw out now that give a sense of perhaps what Fortley and Savage were talking about what happens when we don't recognise that each of these disciplines do have some very cherished ways of working, knowledge, skills, experiences that practitioners aren't going to want to relinquish too easily. So that was a very long introduction. Let's just have a look at this extract that we've got here. Now this comes from the draft expressive arts area of learning and experience documentation. And what it does is it advocates 2 potential approaches to how schools can deliver the expressive arts AOLE. The first being an interdisciplinary approach. So I'm just going to give you a moment to read that description of interdisciplinary. So there you've got very much kind of an emphasis on the individual disciplines. And then we come to the integrated approach. And I'm going to put a little red box here around some potentially inflammatory text that certainly did cause a lot of debate. So I'm just going to give you a moment to read that. So you can probably tell that, as Tom talked about here, the primary practitioners amongst you may be quite comfortable with this idea that all of the disciplines can be taught within one session and connected together and can be taught by one practitioner. Obviously, for secondary colleagues, and actually maybe indeed some primary who feel less confident in certain disciplines than others, this integrated approach could, as Donaldson mentioned, cause some artificial connections and could pose a risk to individual disciplines becoming diluted for any number of reasons. Maybe a lack of confidence on part of the classroom practitioner, maybe time. Actually, if you bring all of these subjects together and you're limited on time, then how deeply are you going to be able to examine each individual discipline? And there were lots of different reactions to this. As a drama practitioner, this was a really revolutionary moment because drama was never a named subject on the curriculum in Wales. So for once, we had a place at the table. We were a named subject within the Expressive Arts AOLE. But for colleagues who were in secondary and practitioners of art and design and music who were on the national curriculum and had very distinctive national curriculum documents that recognised their individual disciplines, the notion of moving to an integrated approach actually posed an existential threat to them and their subjects, and there were some serious concerns that were voiced in various different fora about dilution of subject, particularly when it comes to the secondary context. So if we look now to what we've now got published back in January 2020, we can see a change in emphasis, and we can also see a move towards a deeper advocacy or a stronger advocacy to classroom practitioners to make sure that the disciplinary focus isn't lost. So if we look to the general curriculum design guidance with a subheading of the role of disciplines in learning, you'll find this in the curriculum documents on Hub, we can see that there is a greater emphasis on the need for pupils to specialise as they move through the different phases of learning and stage progression steps in learning. And I think that this chimes with some of the concerns that secondary practitioners were having about the GCSEs and what happens when pupils get ever closer to GCSEs if they've been working in a very cross-curricular way and they haven't been allowed to work with disciplinary experts. Are they going to be ready to tackle the single disciplinary challenges that they will face at GCSE level and AS and A level? So here we can see advice that this will require specialists to teach and specialists to design. So there's a clear mandate there to schools from Welsh Government that disciplines aren't lost. But then if we look to the Expressive Arts AOLE and their specific considerations that they outline for this particular area of learning and experience, we still see some of these approaches and models, the names of them coming through that we've just examined from Drake and Burns, and we can see some potential if practitioners aren't given the time and space to think about and understand what these different approaches mean, then we could see some artificial connections. We could see some cross-curricular pedagogies that are diluting disciplines if we're not careful. So we can see in this guidance that there is flexibility in how a school may decide to structure its curriculum, such as through an integrated, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary or disciplinary approach. So really, Welsh Government are saying there, when it comes to the Expressive Arts AOLE, any of these approaches is okay. So it's really important that we understand what these approaches mean and that we make judicious decisions about which is best for our context and for our learners. Okay, so back to literature now, and back to examining what published researchers have found as different cross-curricular approaches in practice. Now, this actually comes from a primary source by Barnes 2015, whose research into cross-curricular pedagogies identifies 6 common and contrasting ways of using more than one subject to respond to a problem, theme or issue. We're going to look at 2 of the 6 of Barnes' approaches from his taxonomy to achieve a clearer understanding of artificial and powerful connections within and across AOLEs. So we're going to start with the one that you can see on the slide now, the tokenistic cross-curricular approach. So to quote from Barnes, this is where a song might introduce a history topic, but nothing is made of the song. So Barnes suggests that a tokenistic approach are only cross-curricular in name, and they fail to make real connections between subjects or develop learning in more than one subject. So we can see that their music is subservient to history content there, and that they're not necessarily learning anything about how to perform a great song, how to compose a great song. Really, the emphasis there is using the song as a container for learning about history content. So a tokenistic approach. And then another of the approaches that Barnes introduces is called double focus cross-curricular learning. So this is where the separate subject curriculum continues throughout the year. So a disciplinary approach continues throughout the year, but the year is punctuated with frequent opportunities to put newly learned skills and knowledge into action in cross-curricular contexts. Sometimes schools call these drop-down days, so where they drop out of the usual curriculum and they create circumstances where pupils can deal with problems that bring the disciplines together and allow them to work in a cross-curricular way.
So let's bring this a little bit closer to home, because as soon as the curriculum, the Successful Futures document landed, we in the expressive arts side of PGC Secondary realised that we needed to get our heads around this. Now, all of the things we're about to show you is as a result of work that we've done with our students. First of all, just jumping in with both feet and trying out some cross-curricular things, and then some more kind of book-based, journal-based research that we did. So, slight health warning, it's all about the expressive arts. However, I don't think the conclusions that we've come to are just limited to the expressive arts. I think that the things that we're going to say here are translatable to those of you who work within other AOLEs. So this is work that we did here in Cardiff Met. As you might expect, we initially kind of just jumped in with both feet and tried to do some work with different subject students, get them to work together to kind of co-plan things. Our hunch was, when we saw that work, that there were more and less successful ways of combining the subjects into kind of teaching and learning episodes, at which point we decided we'd better kind of bury ourselves in some books and some journal articles, and we conducted, the pair of us, what's called a systematic literature review. It's a kind of literature review. You can go and find out more about it. It basically involved us digging out as many articles as we could about working in a cross-curricular way in the expressive arts and trying to work out what they were telling us about which were the more successful and which were the less successful. And once we'd kind of synthesized all of those things together, we noticed that there was a kind of suggestion that we could perhaps come up with a kind of a spectrum or a hierarchy of better and kind of less good ways of bringing subjects together. And so what we felt was that since Donaldson calls for meaningful connections to be made and cautions against artificial connections being made, we'd better find out what the implications were for us from all of that literature that we'd looked at in terms of finding out which was which. So what we did is we looked at those articles which proposed different approaches, and we tried to kind of classify different ones. So you can see what we've got here in our slide. We've got some articles across the top there, named in the black boxes, and underneath them we've got what these authors called the different approaches that they were able to identify in their articles. So we've just kind of stacked them up there. You can see one of the articles only named one, the one over on the right hand side. The one next to it, a little bit more ambitious, named 5 different approaches. So there they are, all stacked underneath the articles. And what we quickly realised was that there were similarities between those approaches. So what you can see there, we've coloured in the different boxes. What we're saying here is the ones in pink, for example, they're called different things in different articles, but when we read them, we realised that they were very similar. Similar with the yellow ones. They're called different things, they're named in different articles, but when we read them, they look like very similar things. So what we could do next is we could sort all of those out, and we realised that across the articles that we'd found in our systematic lit review, there were 4 different types of approach across all of those articles. And you can see that the 4th one, we've only got it mentioned in 2 different articles there. Some of the other ones appear in a significantly larger number of articles. And that we were able to give them a name. These are just names that we've made up that you can see across the top there. Names for what we felt these categories were. And what we were able to do after we'd done that is propose that some of these were more kind of effective, they were more meaningful connections that came out of working in this way than others. So we created what we're calling our taxonomy here. And peripheral there, that's the one we've stuck at the bottom. We think that is the least kind of effective, the most likely to create artificial connections. We've got the one in the middle there, which is kind of okay sometimes. And at the top of the heap, we actually weren't able to separate these two. We felt that they both provided potentially really powerful connections. And so we've stuck them side by side at the top.
So now we're going to take you through the process of defining each of these 4 classifications, this taxonomy, as Tom says, but we're also going to try and give you some concrete examples about how they look and how they play out in practice, starting with the most artificial in terms of connections and the bottom of our taxonomy, entitled peripheral. This is similar to Barnes's tokenistic approach that we looked at earlier on. So here, the arts discipline is used as a vehicle for learning about something else. So we saw that earlier on with the example of the song used to learn about something in history. And it's often done to make the other discipline more interesting, or to generate an ethos of motivation in which pupils feel more positive about learning, which is fine. But if that's all it is, if that's the only exposure that music gets in whatever context, then that's certainly not going to give the students an understanding of the knowledge, skills, concepts and experience that makes up the rich discipline that is music. So learning in the arts discipline is not a priority in this instance. And we can see there on the slide a number of articles that mentioned this and the names that they gave for this approach. And I've got a quote here from the Wiggins article, 2001, which states, "If it is limited to this, so if the arts are limited to this, we cannot fault our colleagues for relegating us to a subservient position as mere entertainers." So if this is all the arts are used for in education, then why give them a place on the curriculum in the first place? So a concrete example for this, just to re-emphasise, is that the pupils learn their times tables by singing them. That is sometimes also known as a mnemonic. You might use that as a memorising technique. And song is really helpful, but that's not enough to say that we did music. So the impact could be that pupils make very little to no progress in the arts discipline that's been used as a peripheral thing or as a handmaiden for other things. The discipline is not seen as valuable for its own sake, which obviously is a real concern.
And it's perhaps worth zooming out again at this point, remembering what I said about the differences between primary and secondary. And because secondary have that kind of worry about working across subjects, primary don't have that worry quite so much. But I have had the very enjoyable experience of working with primary student teachers, talking about music. And I've asked people what goes on in school, in terms of music. And the kind of strong feedback I've had from a lot of primary students in the past is that there is a lot of music, I'm using my own subject here as an example, going on, but they're reporting that as a lot of it is that kind of peripheral approach. So now we're starting to see, we pointed out earlier on that this was a difficult kind of step for secondary to kind of think in a cross-curricular way, and that primary working across subjects is less of a kind of big leap. Perhaps this is where the hard thinking might need to happen if you're a primary specialist, is it happening in just a peripheral way? It's a perfectly good strategy, it's a brilliant teaching strategy, but then the hard thinking has to happen about whether the subject discipline is actually just there for kind of fun purposes or for kind of management purposes, or whether it's happening in a really meaningful way. So if you're a primary person watching this, maybe this is the point to start having a real big think about that. The second category, this is the one that kind of sat in the middle. And we call it Disciplinary Proximity, which is our kind of posh name, and our slightly less posh name, which we sometimes give this, is Hit and Hope. So, well, we can't use that because you never know, we might publish this at some point, and we can't be calling it Hit and Hope if we put this in an academic journal. But what we mean by this is that it is not always sufficient to just put two disciplines together in time and or space. And when we've worked with our student teachers in their first attempts at co-planning things between subject disciplines, this was quite frequently something that would happen, that the two subjects will be happening in a thing at the same time in the same space. But that was kind of where the thinking would stop as to whether the one discipline was going to clarify or enrich the other. And what we found working with our student teachers was that sometimes it works quite well, but you can't guarantee it. It's not always going to spark a more meaningful connection. It's not always going to enrich the other. And in fact, actually what we would sometimes find is that the presence of the two subjects together would mean that one or the other or both would get sort of all the way down to the sort of lowest common denominator of the subject. It just wouldn't be well served because that kind of really structured thinking hadn't taken place. So again, subject specific examples, but from a music point of view, we might find that we were just kind of messing around with sound effects rather than creating music. It might be providing some sound effects for a piece of drama, for example, rather than doing something musical. Similarly, from a drama point of view, I know that Emma's kind of bugbear was when it would just be freeze frames all the time. Oh, we're going to make a freeze frame tableau, and she'd be grinding her teeth quietly next to me saying, it could be so much more than this. So it's really important, that this is an example here. And again, we're using history. We're perhaps, again, being a little bit subservient to history. Drama can be a brilliant strategy to bring history to life. But if we're using drama to kind of dramatize a historical event and act it out, we can't just do that and assume that we're doing some good things with drama. They may gain some historical understanding, but an opportunity was there that was missed to also gain some drama-specific knowledge about devising and acting. So we have to be careful that we don't just hit and hope.
So perhaps what you're starting to see coming through now as we've examined these two more artificial approaches to cross-curricular pedagogy within the expressive arts, and indeed some of the examples you've given me before, is that actually there is quite a bit of work to be done, not just on a senior leadership level where, they might dictate the approach that is taken in schools, but on an individual classroom teacher level, there is a very important message about actually looking at one another's disciplines, or as a primary team getting together and look at the distinction between disciplines and looking specifically at the possible connections, the possible exchanges that are going to be meaningful and that are going to enrich one subject or the other. So actually time is needed. Time time to look at the documentation, time to look at the curriculum, and to discuss and to co-plan, which really chimes with this notion of subsidiarity. So, moving into our top tier now, where we had those two top categories that we felt, if done well, and if planned well and delivered well, could reap some really positive, meaningful connections between subject disciplines. The first being cooperative development. So this is where pupils use their skills or knowledge, or both, in one discipline to help them understand concepts or overcome obstacles in another, and vice versa. I think the important thing to say about this one is that they need to be happening simultaneously, and that pupils need to be swapping and sometimes considering both disciplines at the same time in the same session, but in a meaningful way. Tom gives a brilliant metaphor for this about building two walls at the same time, so one being the one subject, one being the other, and one kind of helping to give shape and give definition to the other. So development in one discipline helps to prompt development in the other in an iterative process. You're coming back again and again to looking at the subjects together, to looking at them apart. So no one is progressing faster than the other, and no one is subservient to the other. So we need a concrete example of this, and we've got a short video clip that we hope is going to help to articulate it. So here we've got an example of how pupils could investigate how the elements of music influence the elements of drama. Now, the Expressive Arts AOLE name the elements of music and the elements of drama that a drama curriculum, a music curriculum should teach. And that we found actually to be a really useful starting point for our students and for ourselves, looking where our potential commonality existed. So in this video that you're about to watch, we've got student teachers who put together a workshop whereby in drama the pupils were being asked to look at some physical theatre, to create a physical theatre sequence where they were looking at various elements of drama, such as movement, rhythm, pace, tempo, whilst at the same time they were composing using some of the elements of music. You have to remind me, Tom, which elements of music we were looking at. So it was African drumming.
We were looking at dynamics, which is how loud and quiet it is.
Yes.
I think we also looked a little bit at pace, the sort of different speeds that they played on the drums.
Thank you for that. So we can see there that there is a lot of crossover between those elements, and the pupils in the workshop that led up to this very short performance that you're about to watch were simultaneously composing the African drumming piece and coming up with the physical theatre sequence. So they found that the music was adding greater definition to the drama elements, and likewise the drama elements were giving definition and helping them take decisions on what was going on in the composition. So what you're about to see now is a very short performance of work in progress of the African drumming with the physical theatre sequence. So there you have it, and what you may have noticed there was that as the dynamics, as the pace in the music changed, so did the quality of the movement in the physical theatre piece. That's not an accident. So hopefully that gives a clear example, a concrete example of how progress in both disciplines can take place, and those connections and influences between the disciplines can also be articulated and discerned on their own as well. So when we came out of the back of this workshop, it was really easy to see and articulate the progress that pupils had made in music and also in drama, but by bringing the disciplines together, they had helped each other to progress and become deeper and richer as a result.
So on to our final one of the four now. And you remember this was also on the top. They were next to each other at the top because we couldn't really kind of separate them in terms of how effective we felt they were. And you'll probably notice as well as I describe this one, it has similarities with the previous one, but it was sufficiently different that we wanted to give it its own kind of category. This one we've called Common Concept, and this is an interesting one because this is where the pupils can learn about a concept that exists in more than one discipline. And remember, all the way back to that guiding quote, understanding about the cherished things of other subjects. This is a nice way to go about this, finding a concept that you share. The example that we're going to use here actually is the concept of composition, which does exist in music, but we're actually going to talk about it in an example between art and English. So we're edging a little bit outside of the expressive arts AOLE here by talking about English, but you talk to any English specialist and they will be at pains to point out that there is a kind of artistic side to English. It's not just all about the grammar. It's not all about the grammar and the literacy. There is a creative side to English. And this example talks about composition in art and composition in English, and the process of the metaphor of translating between one subject and the other. So this is where we allow the pupils to work in both subjects, to switch back and forth between the subjects kind of seamlessly. And of course, our pupils are quite likely to be stronger and more confident in one subject than another. And this is a neat way of allowing them to potentially solve problems and make progress and get around obstacles in perhaps a medium that they're more comfortable in, and then translate that across into the other subject or the other medium so that they can make that same progress in that other subject. So the example that we found in the article was that pupils had a double page spread in a book, and they were composing in art on the one side and they were composing in their writing in the other. And it meant that if they kind of got stuck while composing in the one, they could flip across to the other side of their double page spread, translate their thinking across into the other subject, perhaps find that it was a bit easier to make a little bit of progress in that other subject, and having moved forward a little bit, flip back across, translate back across, so that they could take that thinking with them into the subject where perhaps they'd been previously finding things a little bit difficult. Again, we're all about the impact here, and what we can see is that we are making measurable progress in both of our subjects by harnessing pupils' strengths and those shared concepts so that they can keep moving forward without kind of banging their head against a wall in the one medium or the one side of the page and unable to kind of go around it by flipping across to the other subject. So that's the common concept, using that metaphor of translation.
Okay, so we've got another pause for thought now, and we're going to kind of return back again to successful futures. And we've got a quote here from Donaldson: pedagogical approaches that allow connection to be made via common questions, concepts, as Tom just mentioned in that common concept category, or skills, should be explored within and across areas of learning and experience. So we've got a sort of provocation here for you to consider what your next steps are in heeding Donaldson's advice and further consolidating what you've done today. What are you really keen to investigate? What questions do you still have in your mind? Perhaps you're thinking, well, this sounds absolutely great, but what about when it comes to assessing the pupils? How am I going to manage that? So I'm just going to give you a bit more time now to just pause for thought and to add any of those additional questions that have come to mind in the chat. Okay, so hopefully this lead lecture has prompted some additional thinking, but has also kind of treaded that line between, you know, high level theory and, well, what does that actually look like in practice?
There's a number of things that you could read. I mean, the Savage book is really good. There's the sort of generic cross-curricular teaching and learning book, but there are also some subject-specific ones like the expressive arts one, which had that really kind of killer quote from earlier in the lecture, so that's good. You can listen to our podcast. It's another painful plug about that, but we do talk about this quite a lot in terms of that one in season 1, where we talk about the work that we did with the students, where we were just kind of trying stuff out. Those season episodes there. Episode 1 is actually Dr. Judith talking about her article in which she kind of interviewed and really kind of spoke in detail with the expressive arts pioneers and talked about the kind of difficulties that they were in kind of trying to overcome in coming up with the curriculum documents for expressive arts. I'm sure many of the themes there will be similar if you are from a different AOLE. The second episode there is us talking about the systematic literature review that we talked about there in a little bit more detail. And the 21st episode is Judith again. She's got a second article out that she's the lead author on, talking about the sort of the implications and the needs for teacher agency, so kind of autonomy and power and the ability to kind of do stuff for yourself and to innovate, and what we need to do about that in order to make this AOLE working a success. So there's loads there that you can kind of get your teeth into, and obviously the articles which underpin those episodes are out or very nearly out in the case of the teacher agency one, and they're worth a read as well. So here's our references list should you wish to go into this a little bit further. Hopefully you found this interesting and thought-provoking.
Thank you for your time today, and enjoy investigating further.
Thank you very much there, Emma and Tom. What an excellent webinar. We've had some really great examples of how to develop evidence-based practice. I think in particular how we can use the research to support cross-curricular pedagogies. And I think it's really got us all thinking tonight. So just as a reminder then, the next webinar is in 2 weeks' time, is Thursday, May the 6th. At 4 o'clock, and we'll be looking at how research champions are helping student research to have impact in the partnership schools, and that'll include a panel discussion. And then the following webinar will be on June the 10th, where we look at principles of professional inquiry and hopefully engage you in some breakout groups. So yeah, just to conclude tonight, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi gyd am eich amser chi heno, a gen i'n edrych ymlaen I weld chi yn y webinarau nesaf. Diolch yn fawr iawn.